there, everyone. Matt here with thevirtualinstructor.com, and this week I thought I would share with you a recorded live lesson that's usually reserved just for members at thevirtualinstructor.com. Now, for this live lesson, I brought in oil painter Ashley Hurst, and for the next hour, we're going to discuss color theory and color mixing, and it's just a fantastic hour. I'm sure you're going to enjoy it, and I'm sure you're going to pick up a few things about color theory and color mixing that you probably didn't know beforehand. Now, our live lessons are part of our membership program. Each week, a new live lesson is broadcast from the studio for our members. And members also have access to all of our video courses on drawing and painting, which includes videos and ebooks, weekly critiques as part of the Members Minute, and lesson plans for teachers. If you want to check out our membership program, there's a link in the description below. With that being said, I hope you enjoy the next hour on color theory and color mixing. Hello there, everyone. Matt here from thevirtualinstructor.com, and welcome to tonight's live lesson. Tonight we have a special live lesson for you. We're going to do a one-night series, and we're going to be talking about color theory and color mixing. I know a lot of you guys have a lot of questions about color theory and color mixing, so I have brought in an expert, and I'm joined tonight by my good friend and artist Ashley Hurst. Ashley is an oil painter, he's a digital artist, and he's also an instructor, and you may have actually already learned from him and not realized it. He is the instructor for Oil Painting Master Series, and he's also written several lessons that you'll find on the blog. So I want to welcome Ashley. Welcome tonight, Ashley.
Well, thanks, Matt. I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad to be with you guys too.
So Ashley's going to walk us through the process of mixing both warm and cool primaries. We're going to talk a little bit about color theory. We're going to talk about color schemes. We've got a lot planned for this evening. If you are joining us live, I want to remind you that there is a chat box. You can log in with any social media network that you might be associated with. And of course, as I see those questions and comments pop up, we'll do our very best to answer them for you. And of course, other people in the chat box can also chime in as well if they want to, if they have the answer to the question that you post. In recent weeks, it's been a good trend to put your question in all caps. That helps me see it a little bit, especially with all the stuff that I have on the computer screen in front of me tonight. The chat box is not taking up as much real estate as it normally does. So if you put your questions and comments in capital letters, I'll be better able to see them, and then we can pass them on to the expert, Ashley. There is a handout that I've created for you tonight. If you scroll a little bit further down this page underneath the video, you'll see it. It's a PDF printout. You can print it out. It is the color theory cheat sheet. So it's going to basically have everything that we're going to be talking about tonight, and probably things that we want to talk about that we'll just miss. Because there's color theory and color mixing is a huge, huge topic. But anyway, let's get on to Ashley. Ashley has been painting for years and years and years. He has lots and lots of experience. And while I'm talking about Ashley, let's have a look at some of his artworks. And Ashley, if you want to say a few words about some of these paintings, that'd be great.
Well, this one was actually about the financial crisis from 2008. And just for variety, the one you're looking at now is about a canyon giant. It's sort of a fantasy piece. The landscape was painted in Reynolda Gardens, the home of R.J. Reynolds. It was begun as a plein air painting and finished in the studio. And the Roman soldier on your screen was a tribute to a famous story, a legend, a Roman legend about a standard having been stolen from Julius Caesar. That's a portrait of my daughter, done on a panel.
Okay. Now, Ashley, you have, that's the wrong camera view. Now, Ashley, you have had some extraordinary experience mixing colors, some experience that not a normal person would have. So would you care to share a little bit about your experience mixing colors?
I feel like I got two different educations. I did go to art school, and I had actual professors. But at the time, I had a job with a landscape artist who used me to complete some of his work, some of the work that he actually signed. It's kind of the underbelly of the art world, so to speak, but it was good to be exposed to that. He would make about 250 copies of another artist's work on top of prints, and then those were sold by her publishing house. And he was supposed to be painting those, but I did those. We would mix pounds and pounds of the same color for about 2 months until one of those jobs was complete. So my morning started with about 3 hours of color mixing. We would fill cookie tins of the same colors and then paint out of those until they needed to be remixed. And they had to match perfect because the quality controls were pretty tight from the publisher.
Now, I'm not even going to go into the legal side of that. I mean, is
didn't-
that
you-
legal?
you didn't-
Is
you
it
didn't hear-
legal?
I don't know.
To do that?
I don't know, but I appreciated the opportunity.
I would not recommend, for those of you watching, I would not recommend taking prints of other artists and then painting over the top of them
no.
and then selling them through your own publishing company.
No. The artist that made the original artwork, she received the lion's share of the profit. It was still all done to serve her artwork.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, that makes me feel a little bit better.
Just know that if you buy a print that has been painted on by an artist, it may not be the artist who painted the original painting. That's just good to know.
Okay, and we know that there are a lot of modern artists today that kind of have a similar approach where they have employees that work for them.
Oh, sure.
Jeff Koons comes to mind.
Sure.
Who they have an army of people who actually touch and create the artwork,
Sure.
and they actually don't even touch it.
As long as the artist is the director, they're still the artist.
Okay. Jenny on here is saying that she enjoys your tutorials and she likes the Master Series. And we have our first question here by Mary, and she's asking, is cadmium dangerous to the painter? We're going to be using a little bit of cadmium yellow and cadmium red tonight, so I think that's an appropriate question. Do you know if cadmium is dangerous to a painter?
It is dangerous to ingest, so you don't want to eat with it on your hands, on your fingers. I was recently in a glass blowing studio, and they were explaining to me that they no longer used red because of the dangers of cadmium, but they use cadmium in powder form. Being that our cadmium pigment is already emulsified in linseed oil or acrylic emulsion, if you're painting an acrylic, that actually kind of protects us. It keeps that cadmium from floating in the air, so we're not going to breathe it. You just want to keep it out from the inside of your body.
Okay, very good. I'll make sure that I wash my hands a little bit better every time I'm finished painting with any cadmium colors. I know that cobalt blue or cobalt is dangerous, but I didn't know that the cadmium colors could potentially harm us as well. So anyway, we're going to go in and talk about color theory and color mixing. And I think the first thing that we probably need to point out is that there's a difference between color mixing and color theory. I think everybody kind of groups color theory together with color mixing, and that's where a lot of the confusion comes in. You want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, sure. The color wheel is sort of a simplification of how a color is supposed to work, but each pigment is unique and reflects or absorbs different parts of the spectrum. Two reds don't necessarily reflect exactly the same light waves. So the colors that you are going to get from specific pigments are more limited than what you might imagine you could get from a color wheel.
Okay, so we're going to start with the color wheel, I guess. But before we go into the color wheel, all color has three characteristics, and you want to talk about what those characteristics are?
Sure. I think of them as being four aspects to color, but I'm also including value, which isn't really part of the color. It's really the lightness or darkness of that color. So there's value, there's intensity or chroma, there's the hue of the color, and then the temperature of the color. Specifically, the hue is sort of an umbrella term. Just the name of for my students, I say the name of a color, like red or blue, different from cadmium red or alizarin crimson, which are two different reds. So they have the same hue, but they're different colors.
So when you spoke on intensity or the chroma of the color, we can adjust the chroma of a color by adding grays to it, or really any color. Any color that we add to another color, we're changing the intensity of the color. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Any two colors that are combined, colors or neutrals, you could be talking about black and white, you're going to reduce the amount of light waves that are kind of coming back at you. It's going to absorb more from that spectrum and become a little less intense and usually a little bit darker too. If you're talking about putting two similarly valued colors together, the result won't be the same as their original value. It'll be a slightly darker.
Now, I know the tendency of a lot of beginning and intermediate artists even is to mix colors and kind of keep that intensity level up really high. And a lot of times we end up with paintings or images in color, whether it's colored pencil or pastel, where the chroma is maybe a little bit too overpowering a lot of times. And it's sometimes a good idea to lessen the intensity. In fact, I think we're going to look at some examples in a little while of where the artist, Van Gogh, has actually lessened the intensity with specific colors in order to bring down some of that brightness purposefully.
Sure. I mean, the color is going to contribute to the mood of your painting. And if you're happy and you know it all the time, maybe you want all of your colors to be bright, but we don't always want to say the same thing.
Right. It's kind of like yelling at somebody constantly.
That's right.
Without any
bright
dynamics
colors
in your
across
voice.
the whole canvas is like the all caps that your questions are in right now. People are going to see it.
Okay, very good. And so with value, I know how important value is, and the students that are on here, they know how important the value is because I talk about value all the time. Do you want to talk a little bit about value?
Value is the most important element to art. Value makes all of the other elements work. In fact, value shouldn't even be an element. It should be the standard fundamental with the elements below that and maybe the principles below that.
Okay, that's interesting.
I mean, even a line doesn't show up on a page unless it's darker than the page.
Right, unless there's some value contrast there. And just to be clear, value is the darkness or lightness of a color. And we create different values of a color by adding black or adding white to that color. Not necessarily gray, because remember, gray is going to change the intensity or the chrome of that color. But the value may change as well, but value specifically refers to darkening a color by adding black or lightening a color by adding white. Of course, darker values are called shades, and lighter values are called tints. So therefore, the color pink, is that really a color?
Oh, I'm glad you brought that up. My students and I argue about this all the time. I, in fact, don't use the word pink. I like to say light red.
Because in essence, that's what pink is. It's a light red. It's a tint of red because we make pink by adding white to that color red. So I think a lot of confusion with color theory comes in with the fact that we've got all these different variations of color, all these different characteristics of color. We have the chroma, which is the intensity of the color, and then we have value, which is the darkness or lightness of a color. And when we think about a color as being an infinite number of values and an infinite number of intensities, that's why we have all these crazy colors that color companies make, like Crayola has all these crazy names for colors. They're a lot of fun, like macaroni and cheese. Were we talking about macaroni and
right.
cheese?
Most of their best colors you can eat, but don't eat the crayons.
But that just makes color theory confusing. But when we break color down into its basic form, its hue, and we look at the arrangement of the colors on the color wheel based on the hue, and we kind of not think about the value and the intensity for a little while, it makes things a little bit easier to understand, don't you think?
Yeah, I believe so. I like to try to separate the aspects of color in my own mind when I'm thinking about them.
Okay, well, very good. I don't see any other questions right now in the chat box, so we're going to go ahead and move on to mixing some colors. We're going to take a look at the color wheel and we're going to mix some colors. So I hope you guys have your paints ready, whether you're using acrylics or we're going to be using water mixable oil paints here. You can do this with watercolor paints.
Sure.
It doesn't matter what paint media that you're using.
The pigments are the same. The only difference is the vehicle between the watercolor, acrylic, oil paint, gouache. It doesn't matter. The pigments are all the same.
Okay, so let's get started. So we're going to go ahead and switch over to the main camera, and that'll give you a chance to get your paints ready. So with that, let's go ahead and dive into this lesson on color theory and mixing. All right, so what you're looking at here is Ashley's palette. Now, Ashley has a very fancy palette here. Mine is the one I made for tonight. I usually use a disposable palette, but the one I made for tonight is just like this. It's glass, but it is maybe 1/4 of the size. It's kind of hard to see how large this is on the camera, but it is a large palette.
This is my travel palette.
It's a travel palette. So you want to tell us a little bit about this palette?
Yeah, sure. I believe in painting on glass because it cleans up almost back to new. A brown palette, for one, the colors stain it a little bit, and it's not at the extreme end of the value scale. When I paint on white, or when I mix colors on white, or I mix colors on black, I can better see the value of the paint, and I can also better see the color of the paint because I'm comparing it to a neutral. Okay. So when I do make a palette, it's usually a piece of cardboard or foam core with white paper and then glass on top, and then I wrap gaff tape or duct tape around the edges just to make sure. It needs to be thick tape so that you're not going to cut yourself. The glass won't come through.
Okay, very good. Now, you're already laying out some colors, and it looks like you've already laid out blue. And basically, you're laying these out in a triangle, I believe.
Right.
And we're going to create two different color wheels. Is that right?
A warmer wheel and a cooler wheel. And I say warmer and cooler because the temperature is relative. You know, blue is going to be the coolest color, but there are warmer and cooler versions of these colors.
Okay, so the blue that you've laid down here, what color is that specifically?
This is ultramarine blue.
Okay.
Cadmium yellow pale.
We'll wash our hands.
And cadmium red. And all three of these colors are warmer than their cooler counterparts that are going to go here.
Okay, so before we get all confused about warm and cool primaries, because most of us are going to look at the blue at the top and say, well, that's a cool color. The yellow is a warm color. The red is a warm color. There's really only in a lot of our minds, we say, well, there's only one cool color and then there's two warm colors. But I think it's probably better if you go ahead and continue to lay out the second color wheel that we're going to create, and we can maybe notice the difference between warm and cool primaries, because it's very important to understand about the color temperature of the colors that we're actually mixing and the colors we're actually starting with. So these were warm primaries, as you mentioned, and ultramarine at the top, cadmium yellow on the left, and cadmium red on the right. And then these colors are?
These are cooler than their counterparts. You'll notice that this yellow looks a little less orange than the yellow on the left. So the yellow on the left being closer to orange, orange being the color most like fire, this one feels cooler to me, even though it is yellow. So, there's the warm half of the color wheel and the cool half of the color wheel. And then with any one hue, you can talk about relative temperature.
Okay, so when a lot of us think about color temperature, we automatically think about the positioning of the colors on the color wheel. But you're saying that even within the colors, we can talk about which way they lean according towards the color wheel.
So, and it's subtle. I mean, the color or the temperature difference, between the blues is pretty narrow. I'm saying that this is a warmer blue than that, but their range or their difference is really tight. Not so with the reds. This red is very cool compared to the cadmium, this alizarin crimson. And of course it's so dark and pure that it almost looks black right now. We'll bring it up with a little bit of white so we can see how cool and clean of a red it is compared to the cadmium.
Okay, so on this side we've got phthalo blue, alizarin crimson, and lemon yellow.
That's
is that right? So phthalo blue up here at the top, alizarin crimson, and then lemon yellow. And these would be cool primaries. And over here, again, ultramarine, cadmium yellow, and cadmium red. And these would be considered the warm primaries. Now, one thing that I just want to point out is even looking at the lemon yellow there, you can see that it almost has a little bit of a greener tint to it, especially compared to the cadmium yellow, which is definitely more orange.
Sure. You can imagine you're going to get a better mixture of, or I'm sorry, not better. It's sometimes dull colors are better depending on what you're going to use them for, but you'll get a cleaner green from the cool yellow because it seems to lean towards green, and a cleaner orange from the warmer yellow because it leans towards orange.
Okay, now you're laying these colors out in a triangle, and there's a reason for that because we're making a color wheel. And I'm just going to switch over here while he begins the process of mixing some of those colors. But basically, we're starting with the primary colors, and the primary colors are blue, red, and yellow. And of course, our pigments are a little bit different with each one of those, but it's still a blue, it's still a yellow, and it's still a red. So these are the primary colors, and we've laid them out the same way that you have them on your handout there and how we've got it here on the screen. So red, yellow, and blue, these are primary colors. We cannot mix any two colors to make a primary. Primaries are called primaries for a reason, and that's because those are the colors that we start with, and all the other colors can be mixed using the primary colors.
Right.
All right, we'll switch back over here. And it looks like you've started to mix up a purple already.
I'm going to start with the purples for both, and of course the colors are going to be so dark that we're going to have to add some white to them to really see what they look like.
So that's an important thing to point out, that even though these colors are pure right now, or at maximum intensity, they still have their own relative value associated with them. For example, if we were to take the color out of the camera right now, we would see that the yellows are definitely lighter in value than the purples and the blues, right?
Right.
And we can see how dark that purple is already. It looks almost black on the camera. It almost looks black here.
I'm going to add a little bit of white to it, just so that we can better determine whether it actually is purple or if it still is more of a blue violet or a red violet. It's just so dark that it's difficult to tell. So it looks like it's still leaning a little bit towards blue. So I'm going to add just a touch more alizarin crimson to that.
Okay, while you're doing that, Mary says, I like a glass palette too. It's easy to make and clean, which is very true. Jenny says, I have an oval piece of glass from a frame. I also have ultramarine, azo yellow, alizarin crimson. Are they cool or warm? So ultramarine is one of those colors that's controversial, but for tonight's purposes, we're calling ultramarine warm. And that's because ultramarine leans a little bit closer to red than phthalo blue, which leans a little bit closer to green. So since the phthalo blue is leaning a little bit more towards green and the ultramarine's leaning a little bit more towards red, we're going to call the ultramarine a warm color. There are people, however, that argue that ultramarine should be considered a cooler color, because if you take the color spectrum and lay it out flat, of course, so we think of Roy G. Biv, red, orange, yellow, blue, indigo, and violet, then the ultramarine is leaning closer to violet, which is closer to, as those people argue, the warmer side of the color spectrum. I don't necessarily agree with that personally, but it's open to debate. I understand the argument for that, but I would definitely say that ultramarine is more of a warmer blue, especially when we're talking about color mixing. We could argue about its location on the color spectrum all day, but we can definitely see that purple that's created there is definitely warmer in color temperature.
I would think about it like this. The blue that you choose is not going to make or break your palette as being warm or cool as much as the choice of red and yellow.
Okay, that's very good. So again, the blue is not going to make a huge difference. It will make a difference, especially when we talk about like cerulean blues.
Well, cerulean blue is a little bit of its own animal. It is a blue, but its natural value is much lighter than all of the other blue pigments.
It is much lighter. It's a great blue to use in your skies.
It's the only blue that really looks like a sky.
Mm-hmm. It's also a great blue for mixing teal or turquoise and those colors, those blue-greens. All right, another question. Let's see here. So my red is cool, my yellow appears to be a neutral, and my blue is warm. And this is the same person who put that she has ultramarine, which would be warm, azo yellow. Are you familiar with azo yellow?
I believe so. I'll tell you what. I've mixed lots of pigments over time, especially when I was younger, and I've kind of settled on a set that works best for me. And here's why. And I don't want to step on anybody's toes. It's perfectly okay to paint with a huge box of paints, but I tend to work from a limited palette with just the primaries. And when I was younger, I worked with just the warmer primaries. And now I do include all 6 of these on my palette. But the reason I like a limited palette is because it allows me to remix a color if I need to. I don't have to remember how I might have used less colors to mix in the first place, and so it won't be quite as hard to rediscover how I got a color. And that's I guess more having to do with painting with primaries than it is with secondaries or neutrals. I kind of steer clear from putting neutrals on my palette or secondaries on my palette because they're already a mixture. I'm not sure what's actually already in there. So you can think about these as ingredients from scratch, And if you use a brown or maybe secondary colors on your palette, that's a little bit more like cooking out of a box.
Okay, that's a good answer. So to kind of go back to Jenny's question, your yellow is going to lean warmer or cooler.
Right.
Because we're not using that yellow doesn't mean that it's necessarily a neutral yellow. It's either warmer or cooler. Most of the yellows that I've come across are warmer.
Yeah.
Lemon yellow is one of those exceptions that's definitely a cooler yellow. But
Right, we don't have as many choices for cool yellow. That's
most are
very true.
warmer because when you think about yellow ochre, which is still really a yellow, it's just more of an earthier yellow, or Indian yellow, colors like that. Those are definitely very, very warm. And then your third color, your blue is warm, so you must be using ultramarine. That's right. And alizarin crimson is definitely a cool red. All right, so Mary asked, I'm not sure I'm understanding warm and cool. I would have thought the cadmium yellow was warmer. And you're right, cadmium yellow is warmer. This is lemon yellow over here. This is the cooler yellow, and it's definitely cooler.
Yes.
And I've got my hand in that black paint there. So I'll just rub it in because it's not cadmium black.
Can't hurt you.
It won't hurt me. All right, so let's see. Adam says, I am working. Oh, Norlene asked, what is the cool blue color? And the cool blue color is phthalo blue that we're working with tonight. But there are several different blues that are cool.
In comparison to ultramarine.
Where would you say cobalt blue is? Would you say that's a warmer or cooler blue?
I have a hard time talking about the temperature of blues. I consider all blues cool compared to ultramarine, only because it feels a little purple to me. Paint a landscape and use ultramarine for your sky, and you'll see the warmth in there. It won't feel like a sky. It'll feel a little bit more purple than it should be.
That's very true, and that's happened to me before. Before I really knew what I was doing with color. I'd just grab a blue and try to mix it with white and create a sky. And you end up with a very unnatural looking sky when you use ultramarine for that blue. So I was just throwing the cobalt blue out there. No one asked that specifically. Let's see. Adam asked, I'm working with colored pencil. I have a question. How do I remove the wax on the colored pencil if I want to start over? That's very difficult to do. One thing you could do is you could use a razor blade and kind of scrape off some of the colored pencil applications, but the problem is not really with the colored pencil applications, it's with the tooth of the paper. If you put on a heavy amount of colored pencil applications, you've probably flattened the tooth and the paper is not going to be able to really accept any more colored pencil applications, even if you were able to remove the wax. So
you can erase the colored pencil to a degree. It is going to stain the paper. If you just need to adjust your color a little bit, that'll work. But if you need to change to a distinctly different color, then the stain on the paper is probably going to keep that from being very clean.
Okay, I know that there are some more questions, and we'll get to those questions in just a moment, but I think there's some interesting things happening here on the palette as you're mixing things up. Remember, just to remind you, we've got cool primaries over here and warm primaries over here. And we haven't talked about this yet, but you can mix a warm primary color with a cool primary color. So in other words, you can mix phthalo blue with cadmium yellow and you'll create a different green. We're just kind of separating this tonight just so we can get a better understanding of cool and warm primaries. But we have mixed secondary colors here. So we've got green over here in between yellow and blue, and we've got purple in between red and blue, and then we've got oranges that are happening between the yellows and the reds, but these oranges are extremely different.
Wow, look at the difference. The warm colors mixed a very clean orange. It looks just like cadmium orange. If you go buy a tube of cadmium orange, this is actually what you're buying. So don't buy a tube of cadmium orange if you have these two already.
Okay, so again, that's cadmium yellow and cadmium red. Going to make a cadmium orange. That makes sense, right?
Very clean, but it's a warm color. If you look at the cooler wheel, they didn't do so well. They mixed more of a brown orange. There's just too much of a cool characteristic to this alizarin red. Conversely, the green is very clean. I haven't added any white to it, so it's still as pure as it can be. And I don't like using these types of words, but it's closer to what you would call a Kelly green. On the warmer side, there's a really earthy green. It's more like a pigment that you can buy called Hooker's green. But again, you don't need to buy Hooker's green if you've got cadmium yellow and ultramarine blue. So nowadays, the reason I like, let me say that when I was younger, I liked a limited palette because the colors felt really tight. If I mixed everything in my painting from just these three pigments, then almost every color in my painting included these three pigments, and they really felt like a family. Now I like to have more variety, or at least have the potential for more variety in my colors, and so I use all of these on my palette at the same time, believing that I can mix almost any color in the spectrum given the variety of the primaries that I have.
Okay, so we can clearly see that even though we're using primaries, red, yellow, and blue, the secondary colors we're getting from these primaries are extremely different from each other. And if one thing about the greens that I just want to point out, because green is one of those colors that is really misused. When people want to paint trees off in the distance, a lot of times the first thing they do is they look for a tube of green paint, and they start trying to paint their trees, and then when they're finished, they wonder why the painting looks unnatural, and it's because they're not really using yellows and blues to make those greens. They're using a green to paint those things. And here we can clearly see this green with the cool mixture, it definitely does not look like nature. The green we would see in nature, exactly.
No, if you saw a tree like that, then it's probably a plastic Christmas tree.
Definitely. And then the green on the left, the warmer green, is very, very natural. It feels very earthy. And in fact, if you put a little bit more of that...
That's a great word. I like to think of the cool color, the warmer primaries as making better earth tones. Mm-hmm. And the world is not made up of many bright colors. It's made of small points of bright color surrounded by lower intensity colors. So if you want your artwork to look more, your color mixing and in landscape painting to be more realistic, more natural, then more warm colors in your palette is a good way to go. They're gonna reduce in intensity on their own as you mix at a faster rate.
But there is an exception. This orange is definitely more earthy.
That's true.
It's very close to yellow
I've actually
ochre.
Seen dirt that was close to that color.
Yeah, it looks like a mixture actually between yellow ochre and burnt sienna,
really
possibly.
Does.
But if you added just a little bit more yellow to that green, you would have probably a sap green, or very close to sap green.
Let's do that. Let's take a little bit out up here. Oh yeah, that looks great.
It looks very, very natural. Mm-hmm. Very, very natural. So if you just stuck in between that yellow and that blue, which is ultramarine and cadmium yellow, you'd have a whole range of different greens that would be very appropriate for a landscape. So anyway, looks like you're mixing up neutrals. I'm just going to kind of get us caught up here on the color wheel of what we've done so far. So we started with the primaries, and we have warm and cool primaries, and so far we've mixed secondary colors. So if we take equal parts of two primary colors and mix them together, we get the secondary colors, which are green, purple, which some people like to call violet, and some people argue that violet and purple are different. And I think, let's see, was it George? George, I didn't mention your comment, but I do think that George said it sounds like people like to argue about color. Yeah, people like to argue about all kinds of silly stuff. I don't like to really argue about color, but there are people that really, really are passionate about color. I can't tell you all the contents of an email that I had with one fellow who wrote me and was passionately telling me that there was a difference between purple and violet, and how dare I go out into the world and share all this miscommunication with people about how purple and violet are so different from each other. Now I've read a lot about color theory. I know that there are people that believe that violet and purple are a little bit different. Some people argue that violet is a little bit closer to red purple, and purple is a little bit closer to blue purple. But you're basically just splitting the section here that we see on the color wheel down into two sections. So you're just basically adding another color, which just makes things even more confusing for people. And we really don't need things to be more confusing. So that's where we are so far. And it looks like Ashley's starting to mix some neutral colors.
Yeah, I wanted to talk or just look at how the intensity changes and two ways to change intensity. You know, we've looked at warm and cool colors, and we've seen how the different combinations make a variety of intensity, a variety of intense secondaries on their own. But let's take some cadmium red and add some gray to it to reduce its intensity, and then let's look at another way to reduce its intensity. So I'm going to take a small amount of gray and add it to the cadmium red, just part of it, so we can see it change. All right, so it's become less bright and also darker. Remember, anytime you mix two colors that are similar in value, even if one of those colors is gray, or in this case it's a neutral, they're going to result in something darker. Now I'm going to take some cadmium red, and I'm going to add its complement.
Okay, so just you said complement, and we haven't really got to color schemes yet.
Right.
But just so everyone knows, a complement is the color that's opposite from that color on the color wheel. So if we're talking about what color you're mixing, red.
Red.
So if we're talking about red, the color that's directly across from red on the color wheel is green. Now I drew that right at the line in between blue, green, and green, but I'm actually talking about that color right there. So you're mixing a little bit of the complement, which is the color that's directly across from that color on the color wheel.
And I can choose either green right now. I'll stick with the warm green, and I'll just take a really small amount, and because it's the opposite, it's going to reduce the intensity of the red. Just like black and white kind of cancel each other out. Now I don't want to make a green or a gray, so I'm only adding a small amount of green at a time. If I add too much, it'll go all the way to brown. Having said that, complementary colors are an excellent way to mix browns. And red and green will give you a different brown than purple and yellow.
Yes,
being another set of complementary colors, which we'll get more into in just a moment.
And if you're wondering what the best combination is to make the perfect brown, I would say orange and blue. Orange and blue, for me anyway, tend to make a very brown. The color that we would think of as being brown. And
brown.
Not some of the other, like purple and yellow tends to make things a little bit of a grayish brown,
yeah.
It seems like. And red and green, we can see that is not only toned down the intensity, but it's starting to become brown.
Right, they're different. You know, they tone the intensity down in a different way. This one is still it's still mixing down into a warmer neutral. This one almost looks like it's becoming a little purple, doesn't it? That's because black and white are cool. I know that sounds crazy, but when you compare, and in fact, they're the coolest besides blue. If you think about all of these colors and all of these colors and divorce yourself from the fact that they're colors and that these are neutrals, black, white, and gray, they do the same thing to a color that blue does. It cools them off.
Well, now, I will argue with you. You said that black and white are the coolest. I would say that the fawns is the coolest. But anyway, I think it's important for people to understand how black's made. How do you make black? What two colors mix together to make black?
Well, that's a great question. Black's been made a number of ways. I'll give you an anecdote. You probably don't paint with lamp black. Almost no one does anymore because ivory black is a better black or a truer black. But a lot of the old masters had to use lamp black, and that was actually, the pigment was actually soot collected from the glass globes of oil lamps. That started as black, and it's not as dark of a black. But a lot of black is actually made by mixing a dark blue several to choose. There are several to choose from, and then a brown like raw umber, which is a super neutral brown. In fact, raw umber is so neutral that if you add a large amount of white to it, it almost looks like it's turning gray instead of light brown. That's how I make the black that I paint with on my palette. I'll mix colors with black, but if I want something in my painting to be black, or if an object or whatever is black, the darkest part of its shadow, I'll use blue and brown for that, or blue and the darkest brown that I'm able to mix from what I have.
And we've done that here at the Virtual Instructor for as long, ever since we've used color media here, we've taught if you're going to have a black object, if you're going to paint something as black, then it's a good idea to mix that black with blues and browns.
That's fantastic.
And that's one of the reasons why if you have a tube of black paint, you mix a gray, sometimes the gray is a little bit warmer with certain manufacturers, and then you go, maybe you run out of that black, you go out and buy a different black, and then you mix a gray again, and then all of a sudden it's cooler, and that's because it's a different company that might put a higher concentration of blue in their black, or the other company puts a little bit more brown in their black.
Right, and even though they're labeled the same.
Exactly.
Even though they're labeled the same.
We've run into that before with students in the past who've been doing black and white paintings, and halfway through they bought another tube of paint from a different company, same color on the label, but of course it mixed differently because of the manufacturing process. Okay, so we've got a lot of colors out here on the palette. We can still see that color wheel over here and that color wheel over here. Hopefully you guys can still see that, even though we've got...
I should have drawn a vis-a-vis circle around this.
Oh, we could have done that.
Palette.
That would have been a good idea.
Yeah.
So we've got some differences in intensity up here. And now the next thing, I guess, is to mix so a few tertiaries. I mean, I don't think we have to mix all of them, but it might be helpful to see some tertiary colors. And while you're starting to mix some tertiary colors, just a few more comments here and questions. Okay, Jenny is saying my secondaries are not looking very pure. And it might be the color combinations that you're using. Now, pure, when you mix a color, you're going to change the intensity. So you're basically changing the purity of the color anyway. And some of that purity change might be more noticeable with some of the colors that you're mixing specifically. And so it not necessarily means that you're making a less pure color.
It may be as pure as those two pigments combined can make.
Exactly.
And if it's not pure enough, then try a different primary color combination until you find the intensity that's working for you. But remember, in your painting, you can make a color feel more intense than it appears on your white palette by surrounding it with grays and browns or duller versions of the other colors that are around it. So there's a couple of, you can have a color that is more intense in reality or just more intense relative to the painting that you find it in.
Okay, Jenny also says, I just mixed my red orange with my yellow green and made a nifty olive brown.
Excellent.
And that makes sense, kind of, because you've got
the green
red,
has
orange,
some blue in
yellow,
it.
green. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so there are some opposite colors already in those two colors, and so they're going to continue to work towards a neutral. And when we're talking about putting tertiary colors together, we're really talking about mixing the whole wheel together. And anytime you put two colors together, the resulting color is going to be a little less intense. Maybe this isn't the best example since that's the brightest color this ring of colors can make. But when you put three colors together, you're working toward neutral. So you just got to be careful with that. The more different pigments you mix together, the less likely you're going to be able to bring that intensity back up.
Okay, Mary says, how to change the value. Adding black or white sometimes makes my color look less natural.
Oh, you're right about that. In fact, I try to use as little white as possible. And you have to paint with white. You can't paint without it. But sometimes if I need, for example, a red to be lighter, I'll add some white to it. But because it is a warm color, either one of these, they're still warm colors compared to the blues, I'll add a little bit of yellow into it every time. If a brown, an orange, or a red needs to be lightened, I lighten it with white and a small touch of yellow so I don't kill that warmth and that intensity.
And I guess the same thing's true if you need to make a color a little bit darker. If you don't want to add too much black, you could add a little bit more blue to tone it down.
Think about blue as a value, and it will, you have to add a fair amount of it to a color before that color starts to look blue. First, it's just going to make it a little darker, but a colorful dark.
Okay, Jenny says, if I mix yellow with Mars black, I get green, which makes perfect sense because of the blue.
You beat me to it.
The blue and the black.
I have this yellow up here, and I was going to add just a touch of black to that.
Well, let's go ahead and
show
do
you
that.
what an excellent earthy green you can get. So,
And that kind of
Actually,
goes back to what we were talking about,
little
how
more
black
yellow
is
here.
made by mixing blue and brown. So there's going to be some blue and black anyway. So it's
Look how much this green looks like the yellow green that we mixed over here. Or I guess they're both yellow green right now. They're both pretty warm.
So that's cadmium yellow, right? Cadmium yellow.
No, I actually used
That's
the
lemon yellow? Okay.
But the lemon yellow looks so pure and clean, but black is the opposite of that, and so it really muddies water, and it muddies paint too. So in fact, if you one of my favorite artists, Diego Velázquez, a Baroque painter from the 1600s, rarely had any blue on his palette at all. Blue was difficult to come by at the time. A little more than 14 or almost 400 years ago. The most common blue was lapis. It's a stone that was difficult to procure and grind up. So a lot of artists use a cool black for their blue, and when they needed it to look more blue, they purposely put orange and red and yellow objects next to it. In fact, that was one of my first assignments in college when we stopped painting in black and white and moved to color. We just added red and yellow to our palette, but my professors expected us to paint blue objects, and it worked.
So basically, they were just using the relative nature of color in order to create an illusion.
The illusion of blue, right? And of course, they're all very dull blues, but it still feels like a blue in those old paintings, partly because the objects or the dress or whatever was in the background, we know it to be blue, and so we just kind of accept the coolness of that neutral as a blue.
Okay, Ken asks, if I mix all of these together, will I get black or a gray?
You're going to get something that's more like a gray, just because some of these colors are relatively light to begin with.
Okay, and
now, if we were talking about taking all of the waves from the spectrum and we were mixing light together, you would get black. So there's a little bit of a difference between mixing light, like on a computer screen, and mixing pigment together.
Yeah, that's a good point. But the scientific definition of color is definitely different than the artistic definition of color.
Correct, and the way it works on the palette.
Okay, Diane says, let's see, I used to have a formula from my first oil painting teacher, lost the recipe when I was 10 for mixing grays. How do you mix grays?
Well, we talked about mixing browns a little bit ago, like mixing complementary colors like yellow and purple, or green and red, and you get grays the same way. You just use more of the cool option. So we can mix let's give it a shot. Let's see what we get. I'll start with an orange and then add some blue to it. Now it's gonna get pretty dark.
That went really dark.
Yeah, we're gonna have to add some white to it just to see what in the world we're looking at here. And of course, this is also gonna help it turn gray because white is half of the formula of gray. What do we have there? It's looking...
It's kind of a blue-gray.
It's kind of a blue-gray. It may need another touch of orange. Of course, if we add too much orange, it'll go back towards the brown side. So you could think about brown and gray as being like almost like the same color. Brown is the warm version of the neutral, and gray is the cooler version of neutral. But you can get to both of those with the same pigments. So that's looking pretty gray.
Like a gray.
That's looking pretty gray. I had a student that would argue with me. Every time I mixed gray, he would insist it was never gray because he knew I wasn't using black and white, and he just wanted me to feel inadequate. But I promise, when you compare this color to any of these, it's comparatively gray. If you think it leans toward a color, maybe you mix these two together and you say, it's mostly gray, but I think I see a little green in there. Well, then the answer would be put a touch of red back into it, and it'll become more neutral. So you have to look into the neutrals and name the color that you believe you see in order to keep working towards that gray.
Okay. Well, Ashley has mixed a few tertiaries, and we're not going to mix all the tertiaries here. We've got about 12 minutes left, and we still need to talk about color schemes. And we've got a little bit of a surprise for you guys. We're going to do a little bit of a competition. We're going to do some color mixing competition. We're both very competitive people anyway, so it should be a lot of fun to do our little color mixing competition here. But we've got to get through what we need to talk about, and that's color schemes. So, but before we do that, I want to just point out the tertiary colors, because those are colors that are also on the color wheel. We've kind of hinted at it, but the colors in between a primary color and a secondary color are called tertiary colors. And these colors are mixed by mixing equal parts of a primary color and a secondary color. And their names are very easy because the name of the color are the two colors that are used to mix them together, starting with the primary color. So we've got, if we mix yellow and orange, we have yellow-orange. Yellow and green, we have yellow green, blue and green, blue and purple, blue purple, and so on. There are 6 tertiary colors on the color wheel. So just peeking back over here at the color wheel, our tertiary colors are blue green, blue purple, red orange, yellow orange, and yellow green. And that makes up the entire color wheel. So pretty straightforward, pretty simple actually when we're talking about the layout of the color wheel. Do you want to talk anything else, any more about basic color mixing here with the palette before we talk about color schemes?
If there's no questions about the color palette, let's go ahead and move on to color schemes so we don't miss those, and we can come back to the palette to address any questions you might have after that.
Okay, so if you guys have any more questions about straightforward color mixing, whether it's mixing grays, mixing neutrals, what happens when you want to, I don't know, any questions you have, now is the time to put those in the chat box. We're going to move on to discussing color schemes, because the whole reason we use a color wheel, other than to know what colors are going to mix or what colors are going to be made when we mix certain colors, is to use the color wheel and the arrangement of those colors in our artworks. And of course, a color scheme basically is just limiting your palette. What I mean by palette is limiting the colors that you use in a work so that you create a painting that's harmonious.
Now, you don't mean limit your pigment like we did with either of these wheels. You actually mean limit which of the 12 colors that show up in your painting. Is that right?
The colors that actually show up in your painting. So that means that you can start with all of the primary. I mean, you can start with all 3 of the primaries and mix as many colors as you want. But
you could start with 50 different tubes of paint if you want.
If you wanted to.
In this instance, but
yes.
We're talking about not using every hue.
Exactly. And that's a very important thing to point out, because I think when we start talking about color schemes, people are going to hear monochromatic and they're going to say, well, I can only use orange, and they'll completely forget about the fact that they can use white and black. They can use the complement of orange to change the intensity of the color. Right. So it's the actual colors that show up in your painting. And we've also got to remember that these color schemes that we're going to talk about are not really rules. They're kind of like guidelines. And in the examples that we're going to show you, you're going to see some really clear examples of where certain color combinations are dominating, but there's also some other colors involved as well that are just kind of secondary to that specific color.
They're not the main characters, but they still play a role.
Right. Now, Marie asked, should we use the same company brand to make a painting?
And that's actually advisable. You know, I've painted with mixed sets before, but and actually the colors that are out here are a little bit mixed, and you may have noticed when we started squeezing the colors out, some were a little bit more oily, some more linseed oil had separated or to come out. Not all paints are equal in their strength. Some brands are classified, or I'm sorry, some I guess lines of paint within a brand are classified as artist quality. That means they're going to be chocked full of pigment. And then there's student quality, and then there's economy. And as you go down in the expense of your paint, usually you're talking about some fillers being added in there, some materials that kind of reflect that pigment, but are not going to mix as consistently with maybe an artist quality paint. What I mean to say is that a student grade yellow is going to be overpowered by an artist grade red if you put them equal parts together. So I would stick with, it's actually more important to stick with the same line of paint more so than it is, or the same quality of paint rather, than it is the brand. An artist quality Old Holland paint mixed with an artist quality Winsor Newton paint are going to be pretty consistent, rather than using an artist quality Old Holland paint and then a student quality Winsor Newton paint.
Okay, very good. Jenny just said I mixed alizarin crimson and the green I made from azo yellow and ultramarine and got a beautiful neutral purple. And it sounds like she's using Marsha Graham. Is it Marsha Graham? M. Graham? Anyway, that's interesting. So I bet it's probably a grayish purple.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, it's those colors between bright and neutral that really hold the world together.
Okay, it's showing up as Trevor, but I know that this is Estelle. Estelle says, Matt, in your video on how to paint waves in acrylics, you said to mix phthalo blue with phthalo green to get a light turquoise. It didn't work. It was dark. Was that the correct mix? It was the correct mix, Estelle, but we changed the value of the color by adding neutrals. So we had to add white to that color. So in that video, I mixed phthalo blue and phthalo green, but I added white to make it lighter. So if you have a color mixture that appears too dark, all you have to do is add a bit of white. If it appears too light, well, that's a little bit trickier, because if it's already got some white in it and you're adding black, you're actually going to change the intensity.
That's
and you're going to make the color a little bit less intense. So, but when you're taking a pure phthalo green and a pure phthalo blue and mixing it together, you can add white right after that, and you're going to make a lighter version of that.
It'll still be a nice clean blue-green.
And Jenny came in and said maybe you need to add some white to that. Yeah, and yeah, I know it's you, Estelle. There she is, pointing that out. Okay, so let's go through some color combinations real quick. And for this, I actually went through and found all examples by Van Gogh, because Van Gogh was perhaps he was great with color schemes. He purposely used color schemes in his paintings and just did a fantastic job with that. And the first color scheme we're going to be looking at is monochromatic. Now, this is not totally monochromatic. There are some yellow oranges in there, and it's kind of creeping over there to the yellow.
But it's pretty tight. The closest color scheme to monochromatic is analogous, and we're just not quite there with this one yet. So, except for that sun, let's call this monochromatic.
Now, I want to point out again that even though this is monochromatic, it's not just orange. It's not just red orange or yellow orange or wherever you want to fit that color category. It's also the values and different intensities of that color as well. And we saw how we can change the intensity of the color. We change the value by what? Adding black and white to it, right? So,
right.
All right, so that's a monochromatic color scheme. Beautiful, harmonious.
Look how it feels. Does it feel loud and boisterous? No, it feels quiet and almost like a memory. It feels contemplative, meditative, and it's because of that single or nearly single color that we're using here.
All right, the next one we're going to look at is complementary. And complementary colors, of course, are directly across from each other on the color wheel. And complementary color relationships are my favorite.
I don't mean to sound like a copycat, Matt, but they're my favorite too.
Well, in this case, this is another Van Gogh painting. They're all Van Gogh paintings. Red and green is definitely dominating here. There are some yellows in there, and the yellow, there's a lot of yellow in there actually, but the red and green are the colors that are popping out.
They're the two brightest colors. They're two most intense colors in here. That's right.
And if you want to know if complementary color schemes are impactful or not, all you have to do is look around you and look at how much they're used on sports teams and logos. The virtual instructor, those are our colors, orange and blue.
If you want to be noticed, you use complementary colors. Or if you want your artwork to seem louder or brighter or have a little more immediate visual impact, then complementary colors are a good choice.
You can really see the use of complementary colors in sports teams, as I mentioned before. When you think about the Minnesota Vikings, that's purple and yellow. We also think of the Lakers, purple and yellow.
Use that too.
Red and green, we think of Christmas. right?
Sure, but think about tomatoes or strawberries or berries on a holly bush. This is how this is how animals find food. Complementary colors attract animals to those berries. Complementary colors in flowers attract bees to the flowers. So in a lot of ways, the food chain begins with complementary colors.
Now, I'll give you a challenge, you guys here, and that challenge is to look around you and try to find these color schemes in logos and labeling. And when you start looking for specific color schemes, you see them everywhere, and you see where designers are using them over and over again. Not just artists. I mean, designers are artists, clearly. But
it's not by accident. They want their work to be attractive to you, and color's a great way to make that happen.
Mary says, my concern with complementary color schemes is that it seems to get old if that's all you do.
That's a great point. So let's keep looking at these Van Goghs because he used them all.
Yes, he didn't just use complementary colors.
You don't want to be a one-trick pony. You want to be able to express all kinds of moods across that spectrum as well.
All right, next one is analogous, and we've all seen this painting before. I don't know what happened to the upper right-hand corner of the painting, but we'll pretend that
it's an old painting.
It's completely there. So these colors, analogous colors, are colors that are next to each other on the color wheel. Now, you might argue, well, why can't I just go all the way around the color wheel? That's all the colors.
Just use every one.
An analogous color scheme is really limited to 3 to 5 colors that are next to each other. So in this case, we've got about 4-ish colors that are next to each other. Yellow, orange, orange, yellow, green, and green, it looks like. Or maybe not green. Yellow, green, yellow, yellow, orange, and
I like to think of if you're somebody that never picks small or large, you always go for medium. That's analogous. It falls right between monochromatic and complementary in terms of how loud or quiet its mood may be.
Yeah, analogous color schemes are a good way to create clear harmony in a painting.
Sure.
It's, with complementary, we've got strong contrast and impact. With analogous colors, there's definitely harmony.
Right. Every color in this painting has yellow in it, so they're related like a family.
And that can be good and bad sometimes.
Yeah, depends on your family.
The next is a primary color scheme, and these are clearly the primary colors. Now, before someone says, "Hey, there's orange in there," yeah, there's some orange in there too. Maybe some red orange, but we can really clearly see the red, yellow, and blue dominating in this piece. And just looking at these, there's so many things that we could talk about each one of these paintings. Composition-wise, the texture, there's so much, the range of value.
Now, there's another way to think about a primary color scheme too, isn't there? These are 3 colors that are equally spread out on their color wheel. So in some ways, they use or make a painting feel full, like the whole wheel is being used, even if a few are missing. But there's other color schemes like this that depend on a group of 3 colors, isn't there?
Right, and it's called a color triad, really. Okay. But specifically, this is the use of the primary colors. Here's a use of the secondary colors. So this is another color triad, and this is an excellent example of a painting that illustrates the fact that we don't have to use the full intensity of a color in a painting. These colors are very muted, they're very subdued. The intensity is really, really low on some of these colors, but we can still see that there's green in there, there's green on the rooftops, there's little bits of green in the background. We've got those oranges that are happening on the chimneys, and then there's purple as well.
There's grayish purples that are so nice.
Purples are so gray, they're so dull, so subdued, but it's just a beautiful painting. It's fantastic. Your eye moves completely. I mean, you're completely engaged in this painting. As far as the composition goes, it's very, very strong, but the use of color is as well.
In some ways, the colors in this painting feel more realistic than almost any of the other Van Gogh paintings because they are so dull. And most of the colors in the world are relatively dull also.
All right, and another example, this is a split complementary color scheme. And for a lot of people, a split complementary color scheme is very difficult to understand. But basically, in order to understand a split complementary color scheme, we know that we need 3 colors in a split complementary color scheme. So you pick a color. So in this case, we'll just pick red.
Okay.
And then we take red's complement, which is green, and then we pick the 2 colors that are closest to green. So our 3 colors would be red, blue-green, and yellow-green. So instead of being a full complementary color scheme of being red and green, we take the 2 colors that are next to green and couple it with red.
Maybe this speaks to Mary's comment a little bit. You know, it kind of hides the complementary relationship a little bit. It doesn't seem quite so obvious. It's just a little bit more variety.
But we can clearly see the reds and the greens here are just popping right off of each
Sure,
other.
the vase itself is the yellow-green, and those cooler blue-greens are the leaves in the table down below.
And those yellow flowers also stand out too because they're outside of that split complementary color scheme.
Is there a term or a word you use for a color that is, you know, shows up in one spot and doesn't really match or fit in with the other colors? It's a way to create a focal point. But what do you call it?
Definitely a way to create a focal point.
I call that a local color. You know, a color that it doesn't really harmonize with the rest of the painting, but on purpose.
And we can see that yellow shows up on all three of those flowers. You can imagine if there was only one yellow flower in there, how much more odd that would look.
Yeah.
That would probably break the harmony within the piece, actually. All right, the last example here is a color tetrad. A color tetrad is basically a color scheme made up of 4 colors that are equidistant from each other on the color wheel. And in most cases, in fact, in all cases, it's going to consist of 2 different sets of complementary colors. So here we've got red and green, and we've got blue, purple, and yellow, orange. So we can see that happening here in the painting. Even in the silhouetted figure, if you look really closely, it's actually a dark blue purple.
Yeah, it's nice to see some color in the shadows.
And it's interesting that Van Gogh chose to make that tree even red or yellow orange, red orange. I guess that's kind of reddish on the trunk of the tree there. That's an interesting choice for the tree, I think, the bark of the tree.
The tree's shadow is warm, and then the silhouette, like you mentioned, has a lot of blue in it, and it is cool, even though they're both the same value. So even a lot of variety in those deep colors.
So anyway, those are a few examples of color schemes, specific color schemes that are used a lot by artists. I mean, I use them. I know Ashley uses them. So when we think about creating a painting and we're mixing our colors, we're limiting our palette by choosing a specific color scheme, it just makes our paintings more harmonious if we think about color in that way. And you can see in the examples that we showed, even though all of these are Van Gogh, they're very broad. There's a pretty wide spectrum of examples that we looked at with different uses of color in the paintings. And some of them looked representational,
Sure.
Despite the fact that the colors were limited. The palette was limited. All right, so I think it's time now for our challenge. Are you up for this? I know it's after 9 o'clock
think so.
here. And let's just switch back over here to this camera view. What we're going to be doing here is we're going to spend just a couple seconds, each one of us, and we are going to try to mix this color. Okay, so I've got a swatch here, and Ashley also has a swatch, and here's my swatch. They're exactly the same. And I think I've picked up enough tonight by watching you mix colors that I think I have a good idea, hopefully, of what colors I need to mix to make this color. Now, I'm going to try my best not to look at your palette while this is going on, and I'm just going to grab some colors off camera here, and I'm going to let you mix for everybody to see.
Okay.
And I'm going to go ahead and just reach over you here and grab the colors I think I'm going to need here to make this color. And we'll spend just a couple minutes here. I'm going to try not to use a lot of paint, so I'm going to try to mix a very small amount of this. This is a yellow-green.
Do I need to use... I'll work from just the primaries, because a couple of these colors are already a little bit close.
Yeah, I think it would be fair.
I'll feel like I'm cheating if I just steal one of these.
Definitely we should be mixing. Sorry for reaching over you. Definitely you should be mixing with the primaries, because that's what I'm starting with here. And I would say this color is, if we had to give it a name, it would be chartreuse. Would that be the color?
Sure.
And I tried to pick a color at random that I didn't look at immediately and say, well, I know exactly what pigments
so you
are going to
mix
go into
this earlier today, then?
I did
this
not.
Isn't your second,
I did not mix
attempt.
this earlier. In fact, I'm mixing it right now for the first. I'm sure I've mixed this color before, but excuse me. Okay, I think I'm about ready. I think I've got my mixture
Oh my gosh, I'm just
ready.
getting started.
Take your time there, because I reached over you and
The way I'm going
grabbed
to
a
think
bit.
about this is I want to get a color that's as close as I can get with only 2 colors, as close as I can get, and then start bringing the intensity down.
Oh, so you're going to lessen the intensity. See, I have kept my intensity up.
Pure.
I have kept it up here. And I would be curious to see if any of you guys out there are trying to mix this color. If you need to see this color, I think the fumes might be getting to me. Man, I really do think the fumes are getting to me. I'm trying to get the image of the color in view here. There it is, kind of in the corner of the screen there. I don't want to put it in the palette, but if you want to try to mix that color, I did not include this color with the resources though. Jenny was already thinking that she has that color. Ken says, thanks for the lesson and thanks for the visitor. The visitor, again, if you're joining us late,
Ken.
is Ashley Hurst. He is the artist who teaches the Oil Painting Master Series course, which is part of the membership program. And also, he's written a slew of lessons on the blog there. So he's done a lot here. And we consider him a part of the virtualinstructor.com. So, all right, let's see here.
Almost done.
Watch out for that cadmium
matte. Trying to warm it up a little bit more.
She knows. Mary knows that I'm using the cadmium yellow in my mixture.
I am using cadmium as well.
You're using cadmium as well. Okay, now I'm looking at your paper now. Okay, so we've mixed our colors, and they're slightly different. So I'm going to, let's see here. I've got my color on my knife here. I'll just leave it there for a few more minutes.
I have thrown both yellows into here now.
Oh.
So if I ever have to remix this again, it's going to be near impossible.
So there's nothing wrong with mixing warm and cool primaries of the same color together, too. No. I often mix alizarin crimson and cadmium red together to create the red that I need to have. Okay. Thank you, Norlene, there. All right, so now it's time for, is there a moment of reckoning here?
Yes. The way I check a color is to actually touch it up again.
I'm making a last-minute adjustment.
Still mixing.
I'm making a last-minute adjustment here.
The way I match a color perfectly is to continue to touch it to my example. And of course, when the 2 colors touch, your mixture either disappears on the swatch, and then you know that you've nailed it, or it doesn't disappear, and you can see if it's cooler, warmer, or lighter or darker and respond to that. So ordinarily, I would touch my mixture to the swatch and then refine it, but we're not going to do that. We're going to just touch them and see who got closest with the first go-around.
Oh, this is going to be fun. All right, wait a minute. We got to slide the palette over, and I'm going to bring my little palette into view here. Look at my dwarf, tiny little palette sliding in here. So before we do this, let's talk about what colors you mix to make your color.
I've used cadmium yellow, an ultramarine blue, and white initially. And then I also threw in a little bit of the lemon yellow at the end, just to try to clean it up a little bit. Now, I felt like I was getting a little too dull, and it's almost impossible to go from dull back to pure or back to intense. So if your colors get too dull, if you're trying to match a color and it becomes too dull, sometimes you'll waste less paint by just throwing away what you did and starting over. But I went ahead and tried to save it by throwing a little bit of the cooler yellow in at the end.
Okay, and I mixed ultramarine and cadmium yellow as well.
Okay.
And I mixed it with white, but I did not add any other colors. I just used those 2. Okay, so you ready?
All right, here we go.
I've got a little bit on my palette, and then we'll touch. Oh, and we're both too dark.
Oh.
We're both too dark. So we need a little bit more white in there, and that's what I added a little bit there at the end. I added a little bit of white to mine, but I didn't add enough. And let's see if this is a little bit better. Oh, and it has disappeared. It has disappeared. So mine just needed a little bit more white, and there yours is gone too.
Oh, I think you got me. I've gone too
You
far.
go a little too light. A little too light. You
Yeah.
can still see some evidence of mine on there. So, what's important to take away from this little fun game that we did here is if you chose to use that green and I chose to use that slightly darker green in our paintings, it wouldn't be a problem. It wouldn't be a big deal.
No.
We want to match our values as close as possible. We want to get the colors as close as possible, especially when we're painting we're painting representationally. But it doesn't have to be perfect. It never has to be perfect. But we're pretty darn close there. Pretty darn close.
I'm satisfied with that one. It took me 2 adjustments, but I would use that. I would go with that.
And I think I just got lucky with my second mixture there.
I'm sure he
with
got
a little
lucky.
bit more, a little bit more white. To be honest, I was sitting here watching the mixing all night, so I kind of had in my mind which 2 colors would make this green, and hopefully now with this little bit of information that we've shared with you tonight, you have a little bit more experience.
I would pick a set of pigments eventually and kind of settle on them and get to know them really well, and they'll start to become like your musical instrument. You always know which buttons to push with that small set of colors that you're using to get the visual sound that you want.
All right, if you have any last questions, now is the time to post them because we're getting ready to switch back over and say goodnight to you guys. So this is your last chance to post any questions in the chat box. And with that, we're going to go ahead and switch over to the outro camera now. So I hope you guys enjoyed tonight's lesson. I know I did. I had a great time tonight.
I just hope I don't have paint on my face.
I have paint all over my hands, and I haven't even been touching the paint. I don't know what's wrong with me, but usually, I'm here drawing, and that's a lot of fun too. But it was so much fun tonight. I want to thank you for joining us tonight.
I'm glad you asked me, and I'm glad I was glad to be with you guys tonight as well.
Yeah, and I think the folks enjoyed it too, and I know the people who are going to watch this in the future are going to love it too. I think there was a lot of information here, a lot of information that's helpful and useful, and hopefully it clears up a lot of misconceptions that folks have out there when it comes to color theory and color mixing. Just to review real quick, color theory is different from color mixing. Color theory is pretty simple and pretty straightforward. Color mixing is where people start to get confused, but it doesn't have to be confusing. We know that there are pretty straightforward pigments. There's lemon yellow, there's cadmium yellow, there's alizarin crimson, there's cadmium red, there's ultramarine, there's phthalo blue, and really, those 6 primaries, that's really all you need.
You can mix almost any color out of those 6 primaries.
Beyond white and black, of course. There's nothing wrong with experimentation either. If you're not sure how to mix a color, try it, see what happens. And the more you do it, the more you'll learn from experience.
You may take notes. When you make a painting, it's helpful to put small swatches on scraps of canvas and right next to them what you used or an approximate ratio. And then you can go back to those little scraps of canvas that you've used almost as a painting sketchbook. Use it like a painting sketchbook.
Okay, well, thank you guys for sticking around for the last hour plus, if you did, a little bit longer than I expected. And thank you to all the comments down there. Ken, I am not going to lick my fingers. And yes, I am going to wash my hands, Mary. Don't trust me, I wash my hands plenty. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and sign out for this evening. You want to say goodbye to everybody?
Goodbye, everybody.
Good night, guys. Thank you so much for watching this video. I am sure that you were able to pick up a couple of things new about color theory and color mixing that you can apply to your own drawings and paintings. Remember, what you just watched was one of our live lessons among over 250 which are part of our membership program, as well as video courses on drawing and painting, weekly critiques as part of the Members Minute and lesson plans for teachers. If you want to check out our membership program, there is a link in the description below this video. If you want to just simply check out 3 of our course videos and ebooks for free, you can do so. There's a link in the description below. And if you haven't subscribed to this channel, what are you waiting for? We cover a broad variety of drawing and painting materials, subjects here on this channel. So if you haven't subscribed, make sure you subscribe and hit that bell so that you can be notified when we broadcast a new video or post a new video here on YouTube. As always, I wish you all the very best in your artistic success.